"You call this dinner?" my sister-in-law barked, shoving the plate away like it disgusted her. My husband didn't defend me. He just told me to apologize. In front of his mother. In front of his sister. In front of everyone who was supposed to love me. Something inside me went cold and quiet. The soup had long gone lukewarm, sitting untouched on the table, and I picked up the bowl and poured it, slow and deliberate, into her lap. Nobody screamed. Nobody gasped the way you'd expect. The whole table just went silent, the kind of silence that has weight to it, the kind that presses on your chest. Brinley sat there frozen, broth soaking into her cream-colored blouse, and I set the empty bowl down on the tablecloth like I was finishing a sentence I'd been holding in for 3 years. Then I stood up, picked up my coat, and walked out the front door without saying a single word. That night was the end of something, but it was also the beginning of something else, something none of them saw coming, because they never once bothered to find out who I actually was before they decided I was nothing. My name is Nova, and this is the story of how I stopped being quiet and started being exact. I need to take you back to the beginning, because none of what happened at that table makes sense unless you understand what came before it. I met Ellison at a coffee shop in Asheville, North Carolina, 3 winters before that dinner. I was 29, working as a bookkeeper for a mid-sized furniture company, the kind of job where nobody notices you until a number is wrong. He was a contractor, easy smile, the kind of confidence that made a room feel warmer just because he walked into it. He asked me what I was reading. I told him it was a spreadsheet, not a book, and he laughed so hard the barista looked over. We dated for a year before he introduced me to his family. I remember being nervous, not because I doubted him, but because I could tell, even from the way he talked about them, that his mother's approval mattered to him more than he wanted to admit. Corinne was a retired school principal, the kind of woman who ran a dinner table the way she used to run hallways, with rules nobody wrote down but everyone was expected to know. And Brinley, his younger sister, had a way of smiling at you while somehow still making you feel like you'd interrupted something. The first dinner at their house, Corinne asked me what my father did for a living. I told her he'd been a mechanic, ran his own small shop outside of town, and that he'd taught me how to keep the books for it starting when I was 14. She nodded, the way you nod at something you've already decided isn't worth remembering, and turned the conversation to Brinley's new position at a marketing firm downtown. I told myself it didn't matter. Ellison loved me. That was supposed to be enough. We got married 18 months later at a small vineyard about 40 minutes outside the city. It was a beautiful day. I remember thinking, standing at the altar, that I was starting a new chapter, that whatever awkwardness existed with his family would smooth itself out over time, the way most things do when people get used to each other. I was wrong about that. It didn't smooth out. It calcified. Looking back, I can see the early warning signs I chose not to look at too closely. During the engagement, Corinne insisted on being involved in every decision, from the venue to the guest list to the color of the tablecloths, and every time I offered an opinion of my own, she'd smile and say something like, "Well, we'll see what actually works," as though my preferences were a suggestion box she wasn't obligated to read. Ellison would laugh it off, tell me that was just how his mother processed excitement, that underneath it she was thrilled to be gaining a daughter. I wanted to believe that so badly that I talked myself into it. I'd lost my own mother young, and there was a part of me, a quiet, hopeful part one didn't examine too closely, that wanted Corinne to become something like family in that older, warmer sense. I brought her small gifts. I remembered her birthday before Ellison did most years. I offered, more than once, to help her balance her personal finances, since I did that kind of work for a living and genuinely thought it might bring us closer. She never once took me up on it. Not because she didn't need the help. I'd noticed things, small inconsistencies in the way she talked about money, the kind of details my father trained me to catch without even trying, but because accepting help from me would have meant admitting I had something worth offering. And that never seemed to be a category she was willing to put me in. The thing about the way Corinne and Brinley treated me is that it never happened all at once. If it had, I think I would have left much sooner. Instead, it arrived in small pieces, spread out over years, each one small enough to swallow on its own. There was the Christmas, where Corinne handed out gifts to everyone at the table except me, then acted surprised when someone pointed it out, saying she must have simply forgotten, as though I were a coaster she'd misplaced. There was the birthday dinner where Brinley spent 20 minutes describing, in detail, a story about a woman at her office who'd married beneath her level, and then looked directly at me while she said it. There was the family group chat that I got quietly removed from after I mentioned, gently, that I thought the family's holiday budget for one particular event was excessive. Ellison saw some of it. Not all of it, but some. And every single time his response was the same well-rehearsed sentence. That's just how they are. You have to understand them. As if understanding them was a job I'd signed up for the day I married their son. As if my feelings were a puzzle I hadn't solved yet, rather than a reasonable reaction to being treated like an outsider in my own family. There was also the summer trip to the coast, 2 years into the marriage, where Corinne booked a rental house with exactly enough bedrooms for everyone except us. So Ellison and I ended up on a pull-out couch in the living room for 5 nights, while Brinley had an entire guest suite to herself. When I mentioned it, gently, Corinne said the booking site must have glitched, even though she'd made the reservation herself, over the phone, and read the room count out loud to Ellison while he stood right next to me. And there was the smaller stuff too, the kind that's almost impossible to explain to someone who wasn't there, because on their own, each incident sounds too minor to matter. Corinne correcting the way I loaded her dishwasher in her own kitchen, in front of guests, like I was a child who'd never held a plate before. Brinley introducing me to her co-workers as Ellison's wife, instead of by my name, 3 separate times, at 3 separate gatherings. The 2 of them exchanging a look, quick, practiced, the kind of look people share when they've had the same private conversation many times before, whenever I offered an opinion about anything involving the family. None of it was loud enough to fight about individually. All of it, together, over 3 years, built into something heavy enough to sit on my chest every time I walked through their front door. What none of them knew, what I never bothered explaining, because I didn't think it was any of their business, was that I wasn't the soft, easily rattled woman they decided I was the moment they met me. My father raised me alone from the time I was 11, after my mother passed, and he raised me to notice things. He used to say that anyone can hear what a person says, but it takes a sharper mind to notice what they don't say, what they avoid, what doesn't add up in a ledger or a conversation. I'd spent my whole adult life reading numbers for a living, finding the one line that didn't match, the one transaction that told a different story than the one somebody wanted you to believe. I'd been quietly reading the Whitfield family the same way for 3 years. I just hadn't decided yet what I was going to do with what I'd noticed. My father used to tell me that the people who underestimate you are doing you an accidental favor because they stop watching closely once they've decided you're harmless. He wasn't a philosophical man. Not in any formal sense. He wore the same 3 flannel shirts on rotation and fell asleep most nights in his recliner with the evening news still playing, but he had a kind of plain, hard-earned wisdom that I carried with me long after he passed, 2 years before I met Ellison. I think, in some quiet corner of myself, I married into that family and let myself be underestimated on purpose, the way you might leave a door unlocked just to see who tries the handle. I wanted to know exactly what kind of family I joined before I decided how much of myself to give them. By the time of that dinner, I already knew the answer. I'd known it for a while. I was simply waiting for the moment I'd stop pretending I didn't. The dinner where everything broke was supposed to be a celebration. Corinne had just paid off the mortgage on the family's lake house, a modest property about an hour outside of town that had belonged to Ellison's late father, and she wanted what she called a proper family dinner to mark the occasion. She called Ellison 2 weeks in advance to plan the menu, assigning dishes to everyone at the table. Brinley was bringing a dessert from a bakery downtown. One of the cousins was handling the wine. And when it came to me, Corinne paused on the phone, according to Ellison, and said, "Just bring something simple. Nothing fussy." I decided, against my better judgment, to make an effort anyway. I'd spent the entire afternoon in her kitchen, making a roasted vegetable soup from a recipe my own father used to make, the one dish I associated with feeling safe as a kid. I remember standing at her stove that afternoon, stirring slowly, thinking about how my father used to make this exact soup on cold evenings after a long day at the shop, how he'd let me taste it from the wooden spoon, and ask my opinion like it actually mattered to him. I remember setting the bowl down in front of Brinley with something close to hope, actually. I thought, maybe this is the night it shifts. Maybe if I bring something of mine to their table, something that matters to me, they'll finally see me as something other than the woman who married their golden son. Brinley took one bite, made a face, and pushed the bowl toward the center of the table like it had personally offended her. "You call this dinner?" she said, loud enough for the whole table to hear, loud enough that the two younger cousins across from her went quiet mid-conversation. I mean, honestly, Nova, I don't know what I expected. I felt my face go hot. I looked at Ellison, waiting for the thing a husband is supposed to do, the small, simple thing of saying, "That's enough," or "She worked hard on this," or even just "My wife doesn't deserve to be spoken to that way at my mother's table." Instead, he set down his fork, looked at me with an expression I can only describe as tired, and said, "Nova, just apologize so we can move on. Apologize for a bowl of soup his sister decided to be cruel about. In front of his mother, who was already nodding along like this was a performance she'd been waiting to watch. In front of the cousins, the aunts, everyone at that long table who was supposed to be family, who I had spent 3 years trying to earn a place with. That's when it happened, the cold. I want to describe it accurately, because I think people assume rage feels hot, feels loud, feels like something exploding. It didn't feel like that at all. It felt like a window opening in the middle of winter. Everything inside me went still and clear at once. I looked around that table, at every face that had spent years deciding I wasn't worth defending, and I understood, with total clarity, that nothing I did that night was going to change what these people believed about me. So I stopped trying to change it. The bowl had been sitting on the table for several minutes by then, shoved to the center where Brinley had pushed it, and the steam had long since stopped rising off it. I picked it up. I poured what was left, slow enough as she had time to react and didn't, because she genuinely did not believe I would do it. It landed lukewarm and heavy against the front of her blouse, more indignity than injury, which was exactly the point. Then I stood, took my coat off the back of my chair, and walked out through the front door into the cold October air without looking back once. Nobody followed me, not even Ellison. I drove for almost 2 hours that night with no real destination, just highway and headlights, until I ended up at a small and near black mountain that I'd stayed at once with my father years before. I checked in with the small overnight bag I kept in my trunk for work trips, sat on the edge of a stiff hotel bed, and finally let myself cry, not from sadness exactly, but from the strange relief of finally admitting something I'd been avoiding for 3 years. I was alone in that marriage. I had been for a long time. Ellison called 11 times that night. I let every single one go to voicemail. His texts arrived in waves, first apologetic, then confused, then, by morning, faintly accusatory, as though I were the one who'd ruined the dinner, as though pouring soup on someone was a more serious offense than 3 years of quiet contempt. The next morning, I packed up and drove to my old college roommate Reagan's house, about 20 minutes outside of Asheville. She asked exactly 0 questions before handing me a spare key and a mug of coffee, and I ended up staying there for the next 3 days, 4 days away from home in total. During that stretch, I did something I hadn't allowed myself to do in a long time. I thought clearly, without Ellison's voice or Curran's expectations shaping the inside of my own head. And the more I thought, the more I started noticing something that had been sitting in plain sight the entire time, something my bookkeeper's brain had already half-registered months earlier without letting me fully look at it. The lake house Corinne had supposedly just paid off. The one this whole celebratory dinner had been for had actually been purchased 2 years earlier using a joint home equity line that Ellison and I had taken out together, back when Corinne told us she was temporarily short and needed help covering a gap before an inheritance cleared. Ellison had handled that paperwork himself, told me it was a small favor, nothing to worry about, that his mother would pay it back within the year. She never paid it back, and judging by the celebration dinner, she had no intention of ever mentioning that the money had come from us in the first place. As far as that entire family was concerned, Corinne owned that lake house outright, free and clear, through her own hard work and sacrifice. Meanwhile, Ellison and I were still quietly making payments on a loan that had our names on it and nobody else's. I sat with that fact for a full day before I let myself feel the shape of what it actually meant. It wasn't just that they disrespected me at a dinner table. It was that they'd used me, used my name, my credit, my labor, while treating me the entire time as though I were the least important person in the room. That's when the cold, clear window in my chest opened all the way. There was one more piece I found while going through those files, something I hadn't been looking for but couldn't unsee once I noticed it. Buried in the same folder as the home equity paperwork was a smaller transfer made about 8 months earlier for a sum that matched almost exactly a temporary loan Brinley had once mentioned needing from her mother to cover a deposit on a downtown apartment. Except the transfer hadn't come from Curran's account at all. It had come from ours, routed through a shared savings account Ellison and I kept for household expenses, one he had access to and I rarely checked because I trusted him with it. He'd moved money to bail out his sister without ever telling me, using funds I'd contributed to for years through my own paycheck, and let his mother take quiet credit for the generosity, while Brinley spent the following months making comments about how I never contributed enough to family gatherings. I sat in Reagan's guest room with that bank statement in my hands for a long time, feeling something settle into place that went beyond hurt. It wasn't just that I'd been disrespected. It was that I'd been quietly, methodically used to fund the very family dynamic that made me feel small, and I hadn't even known it was happening. I didn't go back to Ellison's house. Instead, I did what my father raised me to do when something didn't add up. I gathered every document I could find. I pulled the original home equity paperwork from our shared files. I found the bank statements showing the transfer to Corinne's account. I found 3 years of texts where Ellison had reassured me, again and again, that his mother would make it right eventually. Then I met with a family law attorney, not to end the marriage. Not yet, that decision would come later, on my own terms, but to understand, precisely and legally, what my financial exposure actually was, and what my options were for protecting myself going forward. The attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Delphine, looked over the paperwork and told me something that settled the last of my doubt. Because the loan was in both our names, but the property title was solely in Curran's, my attorney explained that I had strong legal options to seek repayment directly and protect my financial interests if the debt wasn't addressed. I decided I wasn't going to yell about it. I wasn't going to scream at a dinner table or send an angry group text. I was going to do what I do best. I was going to let the numbers speak. I requested one more family dinner. Ellison, desperate by that point to smooth things over, was thrilled I was finally coming around, as he put it. He had no idea what I was actually bringing to that table. The dinner took place 3 weeks after the soup. Same house, same long table, same chandelier throwing soft yellow light over the same china Corinne insisted on using for anything she considered an occasion. I arrived calm, dressed simply, carrying a folder instead of a dish this time. Corinne greeted me with the kind of warmth people perform when they think a conflict has quietly resolved itself in their favor. Brinley gave me a tight smile and, unbelievably, a small comment about how she hoped there'd be no surprises with dinner this time. I smiled back and told her not to worry. There would be exactly one surprise, and it wasn't going to involve soup. I waited until dessert was served, until the table had relaxed into that loose, satisfied silence that comes after a good meal, before I set the folder down in the center of the table and opened it. "I wanted to bring something tonight," I said, keeping my voice level, almost gentle. "Some paperwork about the lake house." I watched Corinne's expression shift in real time, the polite hostess mask sliding for just a second before she caught it. I laid out the documents one by one. The loan application with both my signature and Ellison's, the wire transfer to her account, the payment history showing 3 years of installments coming directly out of our joint checking, and finally, a short letter from my attorney outlining exactly what legal standing I had regarding the property. "I'm not here to make a scene," I told the table, and I meant it. My voice never rose above a normal conversational tone the entire time. I'm here because I think everyone deserves to know the truth about how this house actually got paid for. Corinne, you told this family you paid it off yourself. That's not accurate. Ellison and I did. And going forward, I expect that debt to be repaid in full on a schedule my attorney and I will be sending in writing next week. Nobody said a word for what felt like a full minute. Brinley, who had spent 3 years perfecting the art of the cutting remark, had absolutely nothing to say. Corinne's face had gone pale, then blotchy, the practiced composure of a woman who had run a school for 30 years cracking in front of the family she'd spent that same time positioning herself above. I wasn't finished. I turned the next page in the folder and set it down beside the first set of documents. There's one more thing, I said, keeping my eyes on Brinley this time, though I never let my voice sharpen. I know about the apartment deposit. I know it didn't come from Corinne, the way I think you told people it did. It came from a savings account with my name on it. I want you to understand that I'm not angry about helping family. I'm angry that I was never asked, and that the help I unknowingly gave got repaid with a soup bowl and a room full of people watching me be humiliated over dinner. Brinley opened her mouth, then closed it. For the first time in 3 years, I watched her search for a comeback and come up with nothing at all. One of the cousins across the table quietly excused herself to the kitchen, and I understood, without needing to be told, that this story was going to travel through the rest of the family, whether I said another word or not. Ellison finally spoke, his voice small in a way I'd never heard before. Nova, can we talk about this privately? We can, I said, but everyone at this table has spent years watching how I get treated and staying quiet about it. I think they can sit through 5 more minutes of truth. I didn't raise my voice once. I didn't call anyone a single unkind name. I simply told the truth, in order, backed by paperwork nobody could argue with, until the version of events this family had built, the one where Corinne was self-made and I was an ungrateful outsider who'd ruined a nice dinner over soup, collapsed under its own weight. I want to be clear about what happened after that dinner, because I think people expect a dramatic ending, shouting, doors slamming, and there was none of that. What happened was quieter, and in some ways more permanent. Corinne began repaying the loan within a month, not out of generosity, but because my attorney's letter made clear what would happen if she didn't. She paid it in careful, resentful installments, always through Ellison, never with a word directed at me, as though acknowledging me directly might make the debt feel more real than it already was. Brinley stopped speaking to me entirely, which, honestly, felt less like a loss and more like the removal of something that had been pressing on my chest for years. She never mentioned the apartment deposit again, never offered to repay it, and I decided, in the end, that letting that particular debt go was worth more to my own peace than chasing it through another round of paperwork. Ellison spent the following weeks trying to rebuild something between us, apologizing in the specific, hollow way people apologize when they're more sorry about consequences than about what they actually did. He told me he hadn't realized how bad it had gotten, that he'd say something different next time, that he loved me and just needed one more chance to prove it. I believed that some part of him meant it. I also understood, with the same clarity that had opened up in me that night at the dinner table, that a person who needs 3 years and a bowl of soup to finally notice his wife is drowning isn't someone I could keep building a life around. Understanding why he'd failed me didn't obligate me to stay and watch him fail me again. I want to tell you I forgave him. I didn't. I'm not interested in forgiveness as a performance, in pretending that 3 years of silence at that dinner table can be erased with a few tearful conversations. I filed for divorce 2 months later. I kept my name. I kept my career, which had grown steadier and sharper through the entire ordeal, because it turns out that being underestimated for years gives you a strange kind of clarity about your own worth. I moved into a small house near Reagan's, with a garden I'd planted myself, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, my evenings were quiet in a way that felt like peace instead of exclusion. I heard, through mutual friends, that Corinne sold the lake house within the year, unable to keep up with the payments once she was actually responsible for making them herself. I heard Brinley moved to Charlotte. I don't know if either of those things is entirely true, and honestly I've stopped needing to know. My life isn't tied to theirs anymore, and that, more than any apology I never received, is the justice I actually wanted. About a year after the divorce was finalized, I ran into Corinne at a farmer's market downtown, completely by accident. She looked older than I remembered, smaller somehow, standing at a produce stand with a basket half full. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then she offered a stiff, careful hello, the kind you give a stranger you're not sure you're allowed to speak to. I said hello back, asked how she was doing, in the same even tone I'd used at that final dinner table, and watched her search my face for some sign of the anger she probably expected, some opening to apologize or explain herself if I gave her one. I didn't